Hello, everyone. Professor Cornish here. Welcome to part 2 of our presentation on evidence-based practices using what works in corrections. Now, for part 2, we're going to be talking about risk needs assessments as well as the R&R model. Now, we're first going to talk about actuarial risk and needs assessments. Now, this is part of the classification process. It'll be done more in depth in the initial classification, which occurs when inmates are first incarcerated, as well as it will be at designated intervals. Classification will be redone during reclassification periods. Now, in reclassification, there may be some assessments that are done, there may not be. They might just review what programming the inmate has done thus far. They might look at their disciplinaries, if they're getting close to parole eligibility or the maximum end of their sentence. They may start looking at like their parole plan, their release plan, things like that. Now, first, we're going to talk about assessments. Now, they're a formalized process indicating really the level of service needed by an offender in a given area. Now, with the assessments, they're going to be looking at risk factors, things that increase the likelihood someone's going to offend. Some of the circumstances that cause the inmate to commit crimes in the first place, as well as things that could very well increase the likelihood that once they're released, they're going to reoffend again. And they're also going to be looking at protective factors, which those serve as a buffer to the risk factors. They're what keeps someone from offending or reoffending. So with the assessments, those are things they're going to look at. Now, there's a multitude of different assessments that are used in the correctional field. Some of them are across the board, some of them are specific. Now, actuarial assessments, which are the ones that are actually looking at risk factors, both criminogenic needs, criminogenic risks, the regular needs of the inmate, and then the protective factors, they are highly structured and empirical based. There's been a lot of research on them to make sure that they're assessing what they're supposed to effectively. Now, for anyone that decides to go into case management, any assessment that you will be conducting, you should be getting trained on. Because part of what affects the effectiveness of assessments is the person that's conducting them. Now, it's purely human that's going to be doing the assessment. Some are computerized, but you still have to make sure you're inputting things correctly. But with any assessment, the person that is delivering the assessment and then interpreting the results, they've got to make sure they're interpreting those results correctly, because it can reduce really the effectiveness of that assessment if it's not interpreted correctly. And that's something that individuals that do assessments, they're trained in. And with the training, it's going to help reduce any human error, any bias that could come into play. Now, with assessments, as I stated, there are various different assessments that are conducted, especially with initial classification. So you're going to be looking at the current crime and its severity. With classification, you're also going to be looking at the inmate's previous criminal history and its severity. with assessments, you're also going to be looking at, as I stated previously, the risk factors, the protective factors. You're going to look at education and vocation, medical and mental health needs, etc. You know, you're going to be looking at a lot. And with juveniles, you'll also be looking at family very closely. You still look at family with adults, but with juveniles, it's very much more important. With juveniles, you're especially going to also be looking at school as well and how they're doing educational wise. Now, assessments, one of the things that they are used for is determining if a particular program is appropriate for an offender. Because you want to make sure that, you know, any offender that's going to be in a program, that it's actually suited to them. And we're going to be in a little bit looking at what things help determine appropriateness of a program. So classification is pretty important. You also, with classification, determine the individual's custody level or supervision level. You're also going to be looking at housing, potentially cell assignments, work assignments. I mean, there's a lot to classification. Individuals that do classification, they do get trained in it. Now, just to go over quickly what risk factors are. They're characteristics in an individual that, if present, increase the probability of criminality. Meaning they increase the likelihood that you would commit a crime or that you're going to reoffend. It doesn't guarantee it, it just increases the likelihood. Now, the impact of risk factors, it varies on really developmental state of the individual, as well as the presence of other risk factors. The more risk factors you have, the greater the likelihood is you're going to commit crime. Now, just to note, an individual is 10 times more likely to commit a violent act if 2 or more risk factors are present. Now, with risk factors, also, it's not just the number that comes into play in the developmental state of the individual, but also the significance of the risk factor for that individual. Like for some individuals, having family members that are criminals is a risk factor, but it's going to have a different effect on, let's say you have someone who has a sibling that's a criminal, and that individual highly looks up to that sibling. That risk factor is going to be significant for that person. But if you have someone, their uncle is a criminal, but they really don't look up to their uncle, the uncle's not a role model, they don't spend a lot of time with the uncle being a criminal, that risk factor is not significant and really isn't going to have a major effect on the person. So significance does come into play as well. Now, there's 2 different types of risk factors. You have criminogenic needs, which they're dynamic. You know, they're the ones that can change through intervention, change in circumstances, passing of time, etc. These are the big ones we target. Examples include risk-taking behaviors, substance abuse, inadequate development of coping mechanisms, impulsive behavior, antisocial behavior. The other type of risk factor you have is criminogenic risks. And those are characteristics that they're static, meaning they don't really change. So you have family history of crime, individual criminal history, academic and failure in school, etc. Now, while you can't change the fact that these risk factors exist, you can address the adverse effects of them and reduce those. Now, as far as risk factors, there are what we call the big 4. These are the big ones that through assessments, we analyze to see if they're there and the severity of them. Through programming, we really majorly target these. Now, the big four that predict criminality the highest: antisocial cognitions or criminalistic attitudes, antisocial personality patterns, antisocial criminalistic peers and associations, and criminal history. Now, criminal history is actually static. So just to go back one slide, criminal history, as we can see, it is a criminogenic risk. It's not a criminogenic need. The reason why it is a part of the big four is the more crimes you commit, especially when you've started at a younger age, or crimes that are increasing in severity, the more criminal history is a stronger risk factor. So that's why they look at criminal history as well. So those are the big four that are going to be targeted. Criminal history really isn't targeted because it is static, but the more criminal history someone has, the likelihood they're going to have those antisocial thoughts and behaviors, that they're going to have more antisocial criminalistic peers. Now, these four also become the big eight. And the additional ones that are part of the big eight: education and employment, because those are going to help not only with rehabilitation, but also reintegration. Because the majority of individuals that are incarcerated do end up being released back into society, as well as the majority of offenders that are punished in our criminal justice system are punished in the community-based corrections. So with the big eight, we're going to make sure that this individual, is furthering their education. A lot of departments mandate offenders get their high school diploma or GED. Also, employment, mandated you get a job. And with employment, they may end up doing like vocational training, how to do applications, how to do interviews, things like that. Also, to round out the big eight, you have family and marital circumstances. So basically what's going on in the home. Also, leisure and recreational activities. This is especially big with juveniles, because you'll find juveniles that are delinquent oftentimes really don't have anything constructive to occupy their time. So a big thing that case managers working with juveniles will do is, let's find something that's constructive for you to do, that's not going to get you into trouble, that's going to take up a bunch of time, so you're not going to have this idle time where you're bored and you end up doing what I call stupid stuff. That you're also going to look at substance abuse and dependence, and all of these are rounding out the big eight. All of these are also predictors of criminality. Like with substance use, not only is substance use itself a risk factor, but also substance use creates a lot of other risk factors. Like if you have someone that's addicted, if they don't have money to purchase the substance they're using, oftentimes they'll start turning to crime to get the money so they can get the substance. So the big four and then the big eight, this is what we really look at with the assessments. And this is what we majorly target with programming. Now, the next facet of evidence-based practices is targeting interventions. Now, this is where we apply the results of the assessments. and determine appropriate programming for that offender. Now, targeting interventions refuse to the delivery and selection of programs and intervention. And there are 4 principles that are part of targeting interventions. So this is when you're determining the appropriateness of a program for offender. These are the 4 things you're looking at: risk, need, responsivity, and dosage. Now, the first thing that you're going to be looking at when you determine the appropriateness of a program for an individual, you're actually using the results of those assessments to guide you in determining programming. Because that's one of the things assessments are used for, is helping guide determining programming. And also they give a gauge of where the offender is now. And some assessments, they're conducted at regular intervals, and it's going to depend on the department exactly when they're reconducted. But the initial assessments give you a baseline, and then any subsequent assessment, it allows you to look at really, okay, is this person actually changing? Now, the risk principle is the utilization of assessments to determine the appropriateness of offender participating in a particular program. So with the risk principle, we're looking at the risk of reoffense, the risk the individual poses to society, and the number and significance of the individual's risk factors. Now, with the risk principle, really, if you remember the concept of proportionality, where the severity of the punishment needs to be equal to the severity of the crime, the risk principle is just the same as proportionality. When you're looking at the risk to society, the risk of reoffense, and the number and significance of the risk factors the individual has, you have to balance that risk with the intensity of services. They have to be as proportional as possible in order for the program to be truly effective. Because if it's skewed, it's not going to be effective. Now, programs failing to adhere to the risk principle increase recidivism by 4%, while adherence to it reduces the risk of reoffense by 19%. So this illustrates how important that proportionality is. The intensity of the program needs to be in direct proportion to the risk level of the offender. Now, your more intensive interventions, they need to be directed towards your high and moderate risk offenders, while your lower intense programs, or really your non-intensive programs, they need to be directed towards your low risk offenders. Now, one program that can illustrate this is a diversion program. Your conditional diversion program, where you have more guidelines that the diversioner has to abide by, they have programming that they have to participate in, other things that they have to do, those are going to be reserved for your high and moderate risk diversioners. Or like an unconditional diversion program where, just don't get in trouble for a year, and we'll take this charge and we'll just expunge it, we'll wipe it. Those are reserved for your low risk diversioners. Now, really, it's estimated that failing to adhere to this risk principle through having programming that's disproportionate to the offender's risk, it'll, for a low risk offender having to go through an intensive program, it can actually increase the risk of reoffense by 17%. Now, what researchers are thinking why this happens is, first off, intensive programs are just that, they're intensive. They take up a lot of time. And we'll go into that deeper when we go into the dosage principle, but they do take up a lot of time. Where with a low risk individual, an intensive program taking up that much time actually will interfere with that person's life. And it can end up causing really undue havoc. Researchers are also thinking that the reason why low risk offender in a high intensity program will increase the risk of reoffense, they're thinking it's because of, one, the offender will start thinking, oh my God, they must think I'm a really bad person because they got me in this program. They may also get pretty ticked off too about, like, hey, I'm not like really a bad person. You know, I really didn't commit that severe of a crime. Why the heck am I having to go through this BS? But the researchers are also thinking that the low risk individual being in a high intensity program, they're getting exposure to higher risk offenders. So there's pretty much a lot of things that can come into play with that 17% increase in recidivism risk if a low risk individual is in a high intensity program. However, if now a high risk offender, their risk of reoffense is 51% without programming. So someone that's high risk, if nothing's done, guaranteed 51% chance they're going to reoffend. But their risk of reoffense can be decreased at least 19% if they are going through intensive programming. So high risk individual with intensive programming, you can have an at least 19% reduction in recidivism. Now that's just with that. You'll have other reductions that'll come in with other little facets. So this shows really the importance of adhering to the risk principle and making sure the intensity of the program is in direct proportion with the risk of the offender. You know, if you put a high risk offender in a low intensity program, you're pretty much not doing anything to address their risk. So that's why you have to have them in an intensive program. Now, the need principle. Interventions, really this is looking at now the criminogenic needs and the other risk factors, as well as you'll have offenders with other needs as well. Like if you're a parole officer, for example, and you have an inmate that just got released from prison, if you end up finding out that, hey, they lost their housing, that's going to be your high priority right there is, okay, we need to get this person housing first. So really with the need principle, you're going to be taking the results of those assessments. And you're going to be targeting the greatest criminogenic needs and other risk factors first. So really, you're going to use the assessments to prioritize. The highest priority risk factors you're going to be addressing first. And then you may have regular needs that you'll need to address first. You know, housing, food, work, those kind of things. Now, dynamic risk factors such as like your criminalistic personality, antisocial attitudes, values, beliefs, your low self-control, substance use, criminogenic peers, when all of these are addressed, can reduce the risk of reoffense. So really with the need principle, you're going to be first looking at the big four. The antisocial attitudes, antisocial personality patterning, and antisocial peers. You're going to be hitting those first, and then you're going to be looking at any other risk factors. So it's just with the need principle, it's just now we've got the results of these assessments and we know what the risk factors are for this individual. Now we're going to be prioritizing them and hitting the big ones first and then going down the line. Now, normally you'll end up doing, depending on how things are set up, you'll work on anywhere from 1 to 3 things at a time for goals, and you'll break those down into achievable steps. Now, the next principle for targeting interventions is responsitivity. Now, there's 2 types of responsitivity. The first is general, which that's the use of social learning and cognitive behavioral approaches when you're delivering programs to help maximize the offender's learning and change efforts. Now, I'm not going to go into big detail with general responsitivity in this presentation because through other presentations, I'm going to be going into that concept a lot more in depth. So I'll just save that for another one. Now, the big type of responsitivity that comes into play with targeting interventions is specific responsitivity. And that's matching the styles and modes of programming to the learning styles and needs of the individual offender. So this is really how, now that we know, the risk principle, which proportionality, the risk of the offender with the intensity of the program, and the need principle, okay, what risk factors are we going to be prioritizing first? Which ones are going to be hitting first with programming? This is now determining what programming is actually appropriate for that person. So it's kind of matching it up. This is the individualization. Now, staff need to be responsive to and take into account the offender's current crime and criminal history. Like, for example, if someone is in for a burglary charge, they have no history of sex offenses, you are not going to have that offender go into a sex offender program because they're not a sex offender. It would be useless. It would be a waste of time and resources, as well as it would probably tick the offender off, upset them. And that actually could end up potentially increasing the risk of reoffense. So you're taking into account their current crime as well as their criminal history, their temperament, their learning style, their motivation. Now, motivation is a big thing that comes into play with this. That's their readiness to change. Now, even though, offenders are mandated to go participate in programs, the person, if they don't want to rehabilitate, they're not going to. You look at the old saying, you could bring a horse to water, but you can't make them drink. That's readiness to change. Some individuals, they're ready to change right away. Others, they need some time. Could be months. I supervised inmates, it took them years. Some of the inmates I supervised, I started supervising them when they were 18. And it wasn't until they were in their 20s and they aged out. They gained more life experience, they matured, their brain fully matured, and then they were ready to change. And you're going to have some are never going to change. And if they're incarcerated and they get out, most likely they will come right back. And it won't have anything to do with, reentry was hard for them. It'll be they walked out and started committing crimes again because that's what they wanted to do. We call that they go out, come back in, go out, come back in, committing more crimes. We call that cycling life by the installment plan, is its nickname. So as I said, you'll have some, they're ready to change right away. Others, it's going to take some time. And others, not at all. You also have to take into, when you're looking at the appropriateness of programs, you can also take in their culture, their religion, sometimes race, gender. Like, for example, if you have an offender that is Islamic and you have a Christian faith-based program, if Christianity is a fundamental part of that program, you're not going to be adhering to this principle if you have that Muslim offender go into that program, because you're not taking the religion and culture into account. But that program, let's say it's just a Christian organization that is delivering the program, but Christianity isn't part of it, and they welcome any faith, any culture, then it would be okay to have that Muslim offender go in that program. And that's in a circumstance like that, I would explain to them, hey, I checked into this. Christianity isn't a fundamental part of the program. It's just this organization is delivering it. And let's say you have an offender that has dyslexia, for example. Having them participate in a program where they have a lot of reading they have to do wouldn't be a good fit. That would be a really hard program for that offender because of their learning disability. So you would either want to choose a different program or see, okay, can we make some accommodations with this program? Like, instead of having this offender do a lot of reading, maybe we have the lessons recorded so they can listen to them like a podcast. Or maybe we have more like one-on-one program where the facilitator directly works with this person. So not only with the responsitivity principle, you have to take into account, current crime, criminal history, and all these other factors. As I said, you've got to take into account readiness to change, because you may have to, if this person's not ready, you may have to get them motivated. Now, granted, it could still fail, but you may have to, okay, this person isn't ready. We kind of got to get them there. And you also have to look at the offender's weaknesses and strengths too. Now, the last principle of targeting interventions is dosage. And this is where we're really looking at the intensity of the program. Now, effective programs are structured. So they've got guidelines. It's not just, oh, we're going into class today and we're making stuff up. Intensive. Now, your intensive programs, they're long in duration and occupy a pretty substantial amount of the offender's time. Now, your lower intensive programs, they're not going to take as much time. Like you might only meet like once a week. They might only last like a month or maybe just a little bit. Now with dosage, the delivery of the program has to be strategic, extensive, and have extended services both in the community and in both in the facility and in the community. So for individuals that are incarcerated, they whatever programming they have on the inside, they may still need it on the outside as well. So that's one of the things we look at is continuity of services. And with continuity of services, basically it's services being continued from one environment to another. And one of the things we're going to look at is rehabilitative programming. You'll also have like mental health programming will be in there, medical treatment you'll have continuity services in that as well. Now, as far as your intensive programs, which really the dosage principle mainly looks at your more intensive programs. With the intensive programs, the effective ones that do adhere to the dosage principle, structure about 40 to 70% of the offender's time for 3 to 9 months. So your effective programs, they're a minimum of 3 months. So your less intensive programs are normally under that. And you're meeting sometimes multiple times a week. It varies. It varies on the program because every program is designed a little bit different. Now, the greater the offender's needs and risk factors, the more structured, intensive, and long in duration the program needs to be. Well, that's the end of our presentation. As I said earlier, we went over, the assessments and determining actuarial needs and risk, the risk factors, protective factors. And then we went into targeting interventions, which now we're taking the results of these assessments and we're basically using them to determine the appropriateness of a program for a person. I hope you guys enjoyed the presentation. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, please feel free to contact me. And if there's anything else you would like me to do a presentation on, just let me know. Again, there is a part 1 and a part 2 to part 3 to this presentation. Just because evidence-based practices, there's a lot to it. And trying to do it in one presentation, we would have been here a long time. So I hope all of you enjoyed it. Have a good rest of your day and stay safe out there.